was a brutal murder. It was a frenzy murder. It was a lust murder.
Anytime a domestic partner's killed, the husband's always the first suspect.
People told me that he was something of a con man, that he always had a story, he always had something going on. He always needed to be the center of attention.
It was a twist of fate. It just became a part of my life for the next 15 years.
March 3rd, 1987. A Tuesday in Dove Meadows, a new subdivision in the peaceful community of Spring, Texas, 25 miles north of Houston.
It was a typical morning for Kathy Odom. She was a young mother, 27 years old. She was at home with her young daughter, Tasha, who was 4 years old, and her baby, Sean. She was taking care of her family and just going about her daily ritual. And that included a phone call from a friend, Bonnie, one of her childhood friends. They talked almost every day. Bonnie called, they talked about what was going on in the family, what was going on in the neighborhood. And then around noon, Kathy cut the conversation short because she had to go make lunch for her kids. Later that day, another friend of hers, Lorna, tried to reach her. They often talked almost every day, and nobody answered in the house. Lorna tried again. Nobody answered. This was unusual, and Lorna started to get worried.
That evening, Lorna Portlands finally gets a call, but it isn't Kathy. It's Kathy's husband, Mike.
Mike is worried. He's been trying to reach Kathy. Kathy's at home taking care of the kids, and he asks Lorna, have you seen Kathy? Have you talked to Kathy? Lorna says, no, I haven't been able to reach her. And they both become more concerned. And Mike asks Lorna, maybe you can go over and just look in on her, make sure everything's okay. And Lorna decides to send her husband over to check up on Kathy. Her husband, Gerard, shows up at the house, and he can tell something is wrong. It's just not right. The porch light is out. It's dark. The TV is on inside the house, but yet there's no movement. There's no sound. Nobody answers the door. He can tell something is wrong. And so he goes to a nearby convenience store and contacts the police.
"8:40 p.m. A deputy from the Harris County Sheriff's Department arrives at the Odoms.
He said he went to the house, knocked on the door, didn't get no answer. Checked through the windows, couldn't see anything through the windows. He tried the front door, found the front door unlocked. He went into the house and he heard a baby crying. He went into the master bedroom and found a 2-month-old baby boy on the bed.
Making sure the baby is safe, the officer continues his search of the home. One bedroom remains, the children's room. Inside, a shocking sight, the body of Kathy Odom. There are stab wounds all over her, and her throat has been slashed. The nightmare doesn't end there. Just as the deputy heads out to call for help, he sees another body.
It's Tasha, Kathy's 4-year-old daughter, and she's beaten horribly, and he thinks she's dead. And only when he gets closer does he realize that, in fact, she's still breathing. And so at that point, he rushes out of the house to call in for help.
Actually, it was a twist of fate. I just happened to be working in dispatch at the time. Once the call came in, it being a major event, got my attention. A woman had been killed. Her 2 children were found in the house. it just became a part of my life for the next 15 years.
Police quickly descend on the Odom house and begin the meticulous search for clues. Even for seasoned homicide detectives, it's hard to fathom that something so horrific could happen in Dove Meadows.
And the scene was terrible. It was a brutal murder. It was a frenzy murder. It was a lust murder. She was stabbed over and over again. The killer was clearly in a frenzy. You just don't see this kind of nightmarish scene in this kind of neighborhood.
ID division recovered blood smears on the wall, off the shower curtains, and off the toilet seat. They recovered a cord wrapped around Kathy's right wrist and had been cut from a lamp in a bedroom.
The sheriff's department tries to contact Kathy's husband, Mike, but his neon sign repair business is closed and they can't track him down. Authorities inform Kathy's parents, Charlene and Frank Martin, that their grandchildren have been taken to the hospital. Tasha is still unconscious with severe bruising to the head.
Kathy Odom's father, Frank, told me they really didn't know what was going on. They were at the hospital. Nobody had told them anything about what had happened, and he didn't learn anything until he saw a newscast, and that's how he learned that his daughter had been killed. Now, Frank is a straight-talking, straight-back Oklahoman, but he told me that when he saw that newscast, he cried like a baby.
Mike Odom finally arrives home shortly after 9 p.m. He appears to be in shock and can offer no explanation as to why his wife and daughter would be targeted. There are few answers inside the house either. As disorganized an attack as it appears to be, the killer left few clues behind.
The print that we found off the doorknob wasn't enough to make a match and not enough points. All the blood checked on was Kathy's blood on the wall and on the shower curtain and everything.
The search for clues continues at the morgue.
Autopsy showed that Kathy had been stabbed 10 times in the chest, 6 times in the abdomen. The deepest wound was 5.5 inches in depth. Shallowest wound was 3 inches in depth. Her throat had been slashed 3 times and had semen in the cavities and on the body.
With DNA analysis still in its infancy in 1987, all technicians can do is test the semen sample to determine the perpetrator's blood type. The next step is to match that blood type with a suspect, and there is a witness.
We tried to talk to the 4-year-old daughter, Tasha, and all she would tell us was yes and no. She couldn't remember who had hit her, but she couldn't tell us who had been in the house or anything. It seemed like she just locked it away emotionally.
At the end of the preliminary investigation, detectives are left to wonder, did Kathy Odom open her door to a crazed stranger? Or is there a darker, more shocking secret hiding on Golden Dove Drive?
There was no evidence of forced entry. There was nothing stolen. There was no sign of prolonged struggle outside the one room. For the officers involved in the case, it pointed to one thing. Kathy may have known her killer.
March 1987. Life in the quiet suburb of Spring, Texas has been turned upside down by the murder of 27-year-old Kathy Odom and the attack on her 4-year-old daughter, Tasha. Days after the attack, the whole neighborhood is living in fear, especially stay-at-home mothers. But with no sign of forced entry, investigators wonder if Kathy knew her attacker. Or maybe he had his own key. Detective Ronnie Phillips zeroes in on Kathy's husband, Mike, and a rocky relationship that's been troubled from the start.
Anytime the domestic partner's killed, the husband's always the first suspect. We found it suspicious that Mike had somebody else go and check on Kathy instead of him going home and checking on her himself.
When Kathy started dating Mike, friends told me that she was a sweet, naive girl. She was popular. She was hanging out with the gang in high school. And by all accounts, she was really in love with Mike. They had a strong connection, and they started spending all their time together.
Much to the chagrin of Kathy's younger sister, Shelley.
Growing up, Kathy and Shelley were inseparable. They were sisters that did everything together. They played together, they shared the same experiences, they were together all the time, and then that changed when Kathy met Mike Odom. While Kathy was popular, part of the group, Shelley was the younger sister, awkward, quiet. She wasn't part of the gang, she was the outsider. But that all changed, friends told me, when she was 17 and she met Greg Markwart, who was 25 at the time and had been married to Mike's sister.
Under their boyfriend's influence, the sisters now regularly indulge in booze and drugs, and for a while, it's a non-stop party. But it seems that Mike and Kathy are on a fast ride to nowhere.
Mike became more and more immersed in the drug scene. He was using himself, and he was dealing, as a friend put it, he was slinging pills. Then one day in 1977, he got involved in a transaction for $450 worth of heroin, and it turned out he was buying from an undercover police officer, and he was arrested. Mike eventually pleads guilty to a charge of possession, and he was given 6 years in jail. Now, Kathy's devastated, but she sticks by him, and she's there waiting for him 2 years later when he gets out of jail.
Kathy and Mike are married in 1980 with sister Shelley as maid of honor. Mike goes to work for his father-in-law's sign business, and Kathy becomes pregnant.
Mike appeared to be settling down, but he couldn't quite get there. And then one night, he's driving his Trans Am, and he's been pulled over by the police, and he bolts. He's high, and he takes the cops on this wild chase through West Houston. He's running roadblocks, he's going through stop signs, and eventually he crashes his Trans Am into a police roadblock. As bad as it was, clearly Kathy and Mike had reached a turning point. Their relationship had changed. They were tired of this drug world that they'd been part of for so long. Kathy in particular was ready to move on. They had decided they were going to change their lives.
So in 1986, they start over in the quiet little Houston suburb of Spring.
It was a chance for them to change their lives, to become a family, to have that white picket fence dream that all young couples share. But for them, it was also a chance to escape their previous life.
By all accounts, Kathy was enjoying the suburban lifestyle.
She was growing into the role of a young mother. She was babysitting for the kids in the neighborhood. Her friend Lorna, her neighbor, said that Mike and Kathy were a typical young couple trying to make their way. They were getting away from the problems of the past. And Lorna said that Kathy was a natural mother. She was good at it.
But Mike is having a harder time negotiating the straight and narrow. And before long, he's sucked back into the drug culture.
The neighbors advised us that they had sometimes heard shouting and arguments coming from the house.
Now, investigators need to find out, did all that fighting lead to Kathy's death?
Within a few days of the murder, Mike completely cleared out the house, took all the furniture, left. He never spent another night in that house. He never slept in that house again. He said he could never go back there. He told me later that he had felt that his white picket fence had been burned down. Frank, Kathy's father, didn't buy Mike's story at all. He was always suspicious about why Mike would take all the furniture and just leave. He also felt that by doing that, Mike had taken away evidence that might have helped detectives find Kathy's killer.
Is Mike Odom hiding a terrible secret, or is there more to Kathy Odom's slaying than meets the eye? March 1987. In Harris County, Texas, detectives investigating the murder of Kathy Odom are taking a long, hard look at Kathy's husband, Mike.
You have to understand how detectives think. They always start with the obvious suspect because they find over and over again that the obvious suspect is often, in fact, the killer. They immediately look at the husband. And in this case, the husband wasn't at the house that day. They didn't know where he was at first. He had a known drug record. He was hanging out with some pretty nefarious people. So almost immediately, Mike became their top suspect.
Police talked to several co-workers at Mike's sign repair business to pinpoint his whereabouts on the day of Kathy's murder. They verify that Mike was on a service call at the time, miles from home. Phone records also show that his call to Lorna Portlance that evening came from a payphone at the county courthouse. Court officials confirmed that Mike had to appear at traffic court that night, which explains why he arrived home so late.
Not only did Mike have an alibi, he was willing to take a polygraph test, and he passed the polygraph test, which immediately established to the detectives that Mike was telling the truth. It left police with a nagging question. If she in fact knew her killer and it wasn't Mike Odom, her husband, then the question remained, who did she let into the house that day?
Based on interviews with Kathy's friends and neighbors, there's another suspect to consider, someone who's known Kathy almost as long as Mike. Kathy's former neighbor, Lorna Portlance, tells police that weeks before the murder, Kathy received a series of obscene phone calls that may have come from someone close to home. Her brother-in-law, Greg Markwart.
Frank and Charlene Martin, Kathy's parents, had their own suspicions, and they focused on Greg. They thought Greg was acting strange, and Greg and Shelley didn't show up after the murder. They weren't nowhere to be seen. But then, suddenly, they appeared at the hospital when Tasha, the 4-year-old, came out of her coma.
When Tasha was in the hospital, Frank and Charlene, her grandparents, were there with her. While they were there, Greg, Markwart, and his wife Shelley came to visit. When Greg walked into the room, Tasha immediately had this scared look on her face.
Luckily, the hospital is keeping the little girl under very close watch.
There was a real fear that the attacker might come back to go after Tasha. She was the only living witness to this crime. 2 nights after the murder, Greg and Shelley show up at the hospital at 2 a.m. and Frank Martin told the nurse not to let them in.
Their suspicions roused, investigators asked Shelley and Greg Markwart to come to the sheriff's department to answer a few questions.
Greg had an alibi. He told investigators at the time that he had taken Shelley, his wife, to school, dropped her off, and then went and picked her up later.
We asked complainant's sister, Shelley, and her husband, Greg Markwart, to come in and give us a statement and take a polygraph. And while Shelley was taking the polygraph, Greg Markwart told us he had to go put money in the parking meter. He left the office, and about 10 minutes later, his attorney called us and advised us that Greg would not be coming back to the office. He would not be giving us a statement or taking a polygraph.
He basically just walks out. You've got to picture this scene. He leaves the detectives and then doesn't come back, refuses to take a polygraph test. Now, how suspicious is that? And can you imagine the cojones on this guy?
At that time, Greg Markwart had become our one and only suspect.
As investigators dig deeper into the life and times of Gregory Markwart, it becomes clear he's a man who's always played by his own rules.
Greg was a big, gregarious, backslapping kind of guy. He was always the guy who could score drugs. He knew everybody. He knew nefarious characters. And you could see how a 17-year-old could get caught up in that world.
As a young adult, Greg lives with a wealthy great-aunt and uncle in their sprawling mansion. And before long, Shelley is living there too. Shelley's father is none too pleased with the relationship.
Frank Martin didn't like Greg from the start. He felt that Greg was manipulative, and he saw these mood swings in Greg, that one minute Greg would be that nice, chatty guy, and then he would blow up and be mean. Mike Odom, on the other hand, looked up to Greg. Friends told me that he saw Greg as something of a hero figure, that Greg was the big man on campus to Mike. People who knew Greg told me that he was something of a con man, that he always had a story, he always had something going on, he always had something in the works that he had to share with everybody. He always needed to be the center of attention.
Before long, Shelley plummets into heroin addiction. When she does show up for family functions, she's usually strung out. Frank is at his wit's end. This is not the life he'd envisioned for his family.
It drove him crazy because both his daughters, Kathy, Shelley, they had both hooked up with guys who had taken them into the world of drugs. And it was frustrating, and it angered him, and he felt like he couldn't do anything about it.
And things are about to get even worse. In 1983, newlyweds Greg and Shelley are arrested after a hotel maid finds cocaine, syringes, and a 9mm pistol in their room.
Greg and Shelley both pled guilty to possession, but they caught a break. They were sentenced to 8 years of probation, but they couldn't stay off the drugs. They flunked drug tests and eventually were sentenced to 2 years in jail. And they were in a sorry state at this point. They needed methadone to stave off the shakes and the chills. And by the time Shelley made it into jail, she weighed 100 pounds.
By the time Greg and Shelley get out of prison, Kathy and Mike Odom have moved to the house on Golden Dove Drive in search of a second chance. But when Greg and Shelley come to call, they bring the past with them.
Kathy told friends that she didn't like Greg and Shelley coming around. She felt like it was a memory of a world she was trying to leave behind. And she felt like Greg and Shelley were trying to get Mike back into that world, trying to get Mike to do bad things. She felt like Greg and Shelley were out there to destroy that white picket fence world that she was trying to create.
The Odom's new life is completely upended whenever the Markwarts show up.
I remember Lorna, Kathy's friend, telling me that when Greg and Shelley came over, everybody had an ulterior motive. Shelley wanted drugs, Mike wanted us to go out and party, and Greg, well, Greg wanted Kathy. Greg's interest in Kathy started to border on obsession. One time when Shelley was in the other room giving Tasha a bath, Kathy said that Greg tried to kiss her. And it wasn't an isolated incident. And he wouldn't take no for an answer.
Did that obsession lead to Kathy's death? 3 weeks after the murder, detectives learned from Frank Martin that Shelley showed up at her parents' house. She and Greg had been fighting about something.
The next day, Shelley comes back and wants to borrow the car. She wants to get her possessions out of the house. But 2 days later, she's gone. She never returns, and Frank reports the car stolen.
After he recovered the car, his daughter Shelley called him and told him she'd left some property in the trunk of the car that she'd need to get back. Frank Martin said he checked the trunk of the car and found some men's bloody clothing, which belonged to Greg Markwart. And he brought the bloody clothing into our office, and we sent the bloody clothes to DPS lab. Blood came back being Kathy's. We thought at that time that we had Greg Markwart's, but there was not enough blood to prove that he had been on the homicide scene.
It seemed like a big break in the case, and yet it went nowhere. It was another dead end. The DA refused to prosecute without any conclusive evidence. Markwart wasn't talking. He was refusing to take a polygraph test. He was only communicating through his attorney. And then his alibi, the guy he was supposedly hanging out with the day of the murder, died without the police ever getting an official statement.
With no eyewitnesses, no physical evidence, and no murder weapon, the case is quickly cooling off. But Frank Martin isn't about to let it get cold, even if he has to take the law into his own hands. The investigation into the March 1987 slaying of Kathy Odom has locked its sights on one suspect, Kathy's brother-in-law, Greg Markwart. But after almost a year, without any conclusive evidence, the case goes cold.
The story quickly faded. Neighbors moved on. The detectives moved on. Let's face it, it was just another murder in a city with lots of unsolved murders.
Life carries on in Spring, Texas, but not for Kathy's father, Frank Martin.
Frank Martin is a tough, straight-talking, no-nonsense kind of guy, and he was wrestling with the death of his daughter every single day, and he became convinced that the Harris County detectives had botched this investigation. I think Frank would be the first to acknowledge that he didn't handle it very well. He couldn't come to grips with the emotions and the reality that his daughter had been murdered and nobody had been accused of the crime. And he called people. He called the detectives names. He tried to draw attention to the case any way he could.
In 1993, 6 years after Kathy's murder, Detective Harry Fakaris, the man who took the call at dispatch on the night of the crime, is assigned to reopen the case.
Once I received the case, sat down and read it with my partner, we decided that there was some evidence that could be retested.
Namely, the semen samples taken from Kathy Odom's body.
There was some new DNA technology. We felt like we could get some results if we sent it to a lab again.
By the early 1990s, the advances in DNA technology were such that we can amplify the DNA that was present and increasing the sensitivity tremendously by making many, many, many copies of that DNA. The disadvantage, however, was that discrimination power was still rather weak. We were unable to show that this DNA profile came from a particular person to the exclusion of all others.
After weeks of waiting, the test results come back on the semen from the crime scene. The odds of the DNA belonging to Greg Markwart have now been narrowed down to 1 in 10,000. But for the DA, it's still not good enough. Detective Ficaris goes back to basics, sifting through the file once more. He's desperate to find an overlooked clue, any new thread of evidence that could finally tie Markwart to the crime. He focuses in on the morning of the murder.
We knew that Greg was taking his wife Shelley to school that day and picking her up from school. We went back as part of the investigation to see if she was in school, which she was, and we found out that even though he could take her and pick her up in plenty of time, he also had plenty of time to go to the house and murder Kathy. What we wanted to do was re-interview some of the witnesses. So first we went to Frank and Charlene Martin, and we told them we wanted to speak to Tasha. Then we decided we wanted to take her to a forensic hypnotist. We thought that might be able to help her recall what happened on that day. We did this, we took her to the hypnotist. She was put in a state of relaxation, and it's kind of weird, but she could recall things that happened immediately after that, but she just couldn't remember what happened on that day.
Despite investigators' best efforts, the Kathy Odom killing fades into the background once again. Another unsolved case filed in the back room of the Harris County Sheriff's Department. Still, Frank Martin continues his one-man crusade to see justice done.
For a long time, Frank's anger, his bitterness, was directed squarely at Harry. Harry was his outlet. Frank told me that a part of him died when Kathy was killed, and he couldn't get over that, and he felt that a certain part of his life had just stopped, and he needed to reach out, he needed to vent, and that meant Harry. Harry was the one he reached out to, Harry was the one he called, and it was Harry who had to deal with that.
Frank Martin was a character, to say the least. There were days that I was Frank's best friend. Then there were other days that I was the sorriest person that ever walked on this earth. I reflect back on that now, and I think, what would I have done in that situation? I would have been 100 times worse than Frank Martin.
Having lost all faith in the official investigation, Martin starts sleuthing on his own. He begins to follow Markwart, hoping his son-in-law will slip up and provide the clue that could break the case wide open.
Eventually, Frank actually hired Greg to work at his sign company. His theory was that it's better to keep his enemies closer, and he always felt that maybe Greg would slip up one day and say something, and he felt like it was better to keep Greg close. While Frank Martin was doing everything he could to convince people that Greg had killed Kathy, his daughter, Shelley, was standing by her man. She was very defensive. She wouldn't cooperate with the police. She always refused to believe that Greg had anything to do with the murder.
It seems the town of Spring, Texas will never know what really happened to Kathy Odom. That is, until 1998, when the Harris County Sheriff's Department makes a surprising move.
The sheriff decides to form a cold case unit to look at unsolved murders. And two of the detectives he chooses for this unit are Roger Wedgeworth and Frank Martin's old nemesis, Harry Ficaris. And of course, one of the first cases that Harry chooses to look at is the murder of Kathy Odom.
It has been 10 years since Kathy Odom's murder and 5 years since the last DNA test. 5 years in which the technology has vastly improved.
Initially, the DNA technology required a blood stain about the size of a quarter to be able to obtain a full profile. As years progressed and the technology improved, the sample size diminished tremendously to the point where a blood stain the size of a period at the end of a sentence would be sufficient to be able to get a profile from.
Investigators get a warrant to collect more hair, blood, and saliva from Greg Markwart.
Very cooperative with us. As a matter of fact, he told us that, hey, I'm here to do whatever you need me to do. As we're taking Greg back to the house, just out of the blue, he says, I forgot to tell you guys, but I was having an affair with Kathy back in the day. My partner and I just looked at each other, just are saying to ourselves, are you kidding me? You know, all this time has passed and now you're going to say that you've had an affair with her?
Seems the con man is trying to weasel his way out of trouble once again.
And he knew that if his DNA was on Kathy Odom's body, that he would be in big trouble. So he needed some excuse to justify why his DNA was found on Kathy's body.
Is there anything investigators can do to catch this slippery suspect? Or has Greg Markwart gotten away with bloody murder? Ten years after the murder of Kathy Odom, investigators have hit another impasse. They have a likely suspect and access to new DNA technology. But they also have a new problem. Greg Markwart now claims that he and Kathy were having an affair, which would explain away the presence of his DNA on her body.
Even Frank was giving up hope. He really doubted there would ever be any resolution to this case. And he told me that deep down that he seriously considered killing Greg, but only if he could ever find absolute proof that Greg did it.
We knew that Frank and Greg worked together on these signs, and we just felt like one day we were going to get a call that Greg fell off the sign. Well, we knew that Frank would have probably pushed him off the sign. Frank never did anything like that, although he knew in his heart that Greg was the person that killed his daughter.
As time goes by, Frank and his son-in-law see even more of each other.
Frank and Charlene decided they wanted Shelley back in their lives, and that meant Greg and Shelley coming over for family events. They would see each other, they would spend time together. Did Frank stop believing that Greg killed Kathy? No. But he wanted his family back together.
In 2002, Greg Markwart celebrates his 50th birthday. By now, it's been 15 years since Kathy Odom's brutal slaying.
To Greg, Kathy's murder must have seemed like long ago. He had moved on with his life. He and Shelley were going on cruises. He must have felt like he had gotten away with it. Around this time, the lab in Dallas that was doing most of the DNA work for the cold case unit was experimenting with different techniques. And one of the things they looked at was how to get DNA from the necks of strangulation victims.
By 2002, the DNA technology further evolved to increase its sensitivity and to increase the power of discrimination. This is something that allows investigators to know with greater certainty that they have the right person.
The lab's work on strangulation victims reminds detectives of one piece of evidence from the Odom case that's never been examined for DNA.
We saw that there was an electrical cord tied to Kathy's wrist. We felt like that we could send that to a lab and see if we could get any of Greg's DNA off of it. We decided to send that cord, which had never been tested before, to a DNA lab.
One of the newer advances in DNA technology utilizes what's called touch DNA. which is simply skin cells that are left behind on an item touched by an individual. We're constantly shedding cells, and those cells are there and can be detected. On the lamp cord, there would be a mixture of DNA from the victim because it was around her wrists, but also from the individual who placed the cord on her wrists.
Now, I still recall the day that we received the news that we had results on the cord, that we had Greg Markwart's DNA on the lamp cord mixed with Kathy's blood. I can't even tell you the feeling when I found that out.
How else could Greg Markwart's DNA get on the lamp cord that was tied to Kathy Odom's wrist? There was only one way. He was there. And for the first time, they had conclusive evidence.
December 18th, 2002. After 15 years of dead ends and frustrating setbacks, Detectives Vaqueris and Wedgeworth arrest Greg Markwart for the first-degree murder of Kathy Odom.
I still recall the feeling that I had that I was going to give Frank Martin the best Christmas present ever.
Despite the new DNA evidence, Shelley Markwart still believes her husband is innocent.
Greg's defense attorney told me that the DNA on the lamp cord was circumstantial evidence that Greg had been in the house many, many times. He, after all, was, in fact, Kathy's brother-in-law. So maybe the DNA was on the lamp cord from a previous visit. However, that's not how it worked out. After all these years, after all the denials, Greg pled guilty in 2004. He accepted a plea bargain, acknowledged the crime, and took a sentence of 45 years in order to avoid the death penalty. To me, the most captivating part of this story has always been the idea of everybody pretty much knew who killed Kathy Odom. Frank Martin knew in his heart and always believed that Greg Markwart had killed his daughter. But Greg didn't disappear. He was always there. He was down the street. He was working with Frank. And I just can't even imagine what that would have been like if you're Frank Martin and you know this guy killed your daughter. What would that have been like?
Greg Markwart's life sentence is much shorter than expected. In 2008, after just a few years behind bars, he dies of liver disease. Justice is finally served.